It is my honor to introduce our Day 2 keynote speaker, Dr. Lorena Fontaine, Indigenous Academic Lead, Co-Director of Indigenous Language Program, and Associate Professor in the Department of Indigenous Studies at the University of Winnipeg. Lorena is a Cree-Anishinabe and a member of the Sagkeeng First Nation in Manitoba. She is the Indigenous Academic Lead, Co-Director of the Indigenous Language Program, and Associate Professor in the Department of Indigenous Studies at U of W. Her PhD research is on Aboriginal language rights in Canada, was produced in CBC documentary entitled Undoing Linguicide, which was awarded the 2017 RTDNA Adrian Clarkson Award for Diversity Radio and Network. Lorena has spoken nationally and internationally and has authored articles on residential school issues and Indigenous language rights in Canada. Our most recent publication, Our Languages Are Sacred, Indigenous Language Rights in Canada, is contained in a collection of essays that reflects the recommendations of Indigenous legal scholars and policy leaders on how Canada can bring together a new legal framework through the implementation of UN Declaration on the Rights of the Indigenous Peoples. She has also worked with the Assembly of First Nations as an advisor on Aboriginal languages for a number of years. Lorena is a former Equality Rights Panel member of the Court Challenges Program and Steering Committee member of the National Association of Women and the Law. So please join me in welcoming Lorena.
Bonjour, Maigan Gijik Indishnikas, Maigan and Dudam. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really honored to be here today speaking to all of you. I was really touched by the music this morning and the sound of children singing. It's really that the work that we do is for the children, you know, for the future, so that they will be grounded in their identity and their culture. And I would just like to say miigwech to MALS for inviting me here today to speak at this symposium. I've been working with MALS for a number of years, and I admire everybody that's been involved in language revitalization. The work that is done by MALS is so critical. So I'm going to talk today about activism and Indigenous languages at the local and the national level. And I have a picture here of my family on my mother's side. My grandparents are, of course, at the, you know, at the head of the picture, and then all my aunts and uncles and my mother are in the picture as well. I'm going to be referring to them in my talk, but I thought it was appropriate that I place them behind me today, because if it wasn't for their advocacy work and their love for our Cree language and culture, I wouldn't be here today. So I'm going to share my screen. So I initially started my advocacy work when I was working on residential school claims in 2000. And I thought for a while that that's where my advocacy, my activism work started, but it was really the work of my grandparents that has influenced and grounded the work that I do. And I'm going to talk about them in a minute. But back in 2000, the issue of loss of language and culture became predominant on a national scale. I was working on residential school claims, and I was speaking to survivors across the country. And over again, I kept hearing that loss of language and culture was critical to residential school claims. And the part that really baffled me was that lawyers didn't know what to do with that. And their response was, we don't know how to deal with loss of language and culture because Aboriginal people, Indigenous people, don't have language rights in the Constitution. And I was really shocked by that response because we are the first languages of this country. We had experienced severe injustices with languages in the residential schools. And I just thought it was implicit that we had language rights in this country. And so I became very concerned by not only the response by the lawyers, but the fact that in the Constitution, there was no recognition of Indigenous language rights explicitly, because as we know, minority language rights do have constitutional status. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that later in the talk as well. But during this time, I started to reflect back on my family. I started to think about the relationship that we had to our language. And I started to ask questions. And I was told this story that I'm going to share with you today about my grandparents and their activism work. So in this picture, you see Elizabeth Jane Young. Her maiden name is Big Nell. It's my grandmother. And John Young is my grandfather, both from the Opaskwayak Cree Nation, and raised 15 children, 3 sets of twins, and all fluent Cree speakers. So again, here's the picture of my family. So my maternal grandparents, my grandfather was a trapper, and whenever they would travel to the trap line, it would take a couple of days for my family to arrive there. They would travel by horse and buggy. And it was on the land that my mother said that she felt the most free and the most at home in the world. 14 out of the 15 children were sent to residential schools. And in spite of the abuses that they experienced for speaking Cree, all 15 remain fluent Cree speakers. And I was told that they remained fluent in the Cree language was because of my grandparents' activism. They enforced a very strict rule in the house. No one was ever to speak English. Everyone had to speak Cree when they entered our home or entered their home. In fact, my grandmother never spoke any English ever. When my grandparents noticed that the children were returning home from the schools speaking English and they were being rude, my grandmother knew that she had to do something to change that. She took matters into her own hands, and she told my grandfather that they were going to keep a few children at home every year and hide them on the trap line. They knew that the Indian agent would not be able to find them there. And it was an opportunity for them to re-immerse a few children at a time into the language and into the culture on the land. Hearing this story was life-changing for me. I realized my grandparents risked their freedom by keeping the children home during the school year. During this period, any Aboriginal person that did not send their children to a residential school could be fined or imprisoned or both. And when I was working on the residential school claims, I heard a number of Indigenous people say they remember their parents being put into jail for periods of time because they refused to send them to residential school. And as I reflected on my grandparents' brave efforts, I realized how important it was for them to speak Cree and for the children to know their identity, and they were willing to risk their freedom in order for this to occur. I realized in a very tangible way after hearing this story that Indigenous languages matter and that they're critical to our identity and our future. Up to that point, I thought it was normal that I was sent to a French immersion school and I would come home at night speaking English with my mother and father and my aunts and uncles. But during family gatherings, my aunts and uncles would speak Cree to my grandparents. And when my grandparents spoke to me, my mother would have to translate because they didn't speak English. I also thought it was normal that when I walked into a room that my aunts and uncles would switch to English. And then after I heard the story about what my grandparents did, and I also heard that residential school survivors talked about the shame they felt when they left the schools and for speaking their language, I realized that that shame had infiltrated my family's relationship to our language and our cultural identity. I started to feel a great deal of sadness also because I couldn't carry on a conversation with my grandparents in Cree. And, but at the same time, hearing that story ignited activism and the love that I now have for my Cree culture and language. And I just want to talk to you a little bit this morning about not only were my grandparents activists, but we also had a number of language advocates across the country that have been advocating for Indigenous language rights for a number of years. And I put together this PowerPoint presentation to just demonstrate all the work that's been done over the years by our communities for the protection and advancement of Indigenous language rights. All this work led up to the Indigenous Languages Act that we heard about this morning. And I want to talk about some of these efforts and emphasize the work that our leaders have done over the years in advocating for Indigenous language rights. And then that in fact, that this activist work influenced the Indigenous Languages Act that we have now today. So in the 1960s, there was a Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism that was established to examine the status of English and French language and culture in Canada. It was during this period, the Francophone community, they were concerned about their socioeconomic inferiority of French in Quebec and the economic dominance of English in Canada. And although the mandate of this commission did not include Indigenous languages, Indigenous peoples came and appeared before the B&B Commission, the Bilingualism and Bicultural Commission, to raise issues related to Indigenous languages. And this was really the start of national activism in a very public way regarding Indigenous language rights. And I'll just give you a few examples of what Indigenous peoples were saying during this time. In Sudbury, an Indigenous woman went to the B&B Commission and demanded to make a presentation. She was appalled that Indigenous peoples were excluded from the process, and she asked, quote, "Why is the Indian always forgotten? This was the first culture of the country, and we speak the first languages in Canada. We are told that the British North American Act was between the French and the English, Where was the Indian during this time? In Victoria, an Indigenous man from Quebec said to the B&B Commission, "My grandchildren no longer know the language of my people, but they can speak French." After hearing from some Indigenous peoples, the B&B Commission concluded that Canada's assimilation policy raises very complex problems, and the process of integration calls into question the very nature of the traditions and customs of Native society. The commissioners strongly recommended that everything had to be done to preserve the Indigenous languages of Canada because they are an essential part of our country, and that the Canadian government should take the necessary steps to assist the survival of Indigenous languages. The B&B commissioners recommended that a special commission was required to examine the status of Indigenous languages and cultures. Ironically, after the release of the B&B report, the federal government included in that same year a statement of the Government of Canada on Indian policy, which was the white paper, the 1969 white paper. It recommended the abolishment of Indigenous rights and the status of Indigenous peoples politically. And of course, our leaders were outraged and opposition was expressed across the country. And so if you look at the timeline here, 1971, it was the MIB, the Manitoba Indian Brotherhood, that started advocating for local control of Indian education. And they also talked about the fact that our education system was failing Indigenous peoples. They wanted us, of course, to have control of Indian education, but they also made recommendations about how to advance Indigenous languages through teacher education. A year later, in 1972, the National Indian Brotherhood, which is now the AFN, they released a policy document called Indian Control of Indian Education. And they presented this policy document to the Minister of Indian Affairs and Northern Development. And they came out with policies and goals for the government that would serve as a foundation for the future schools and programs for Indigenous children. And they expressed the importance of Indigenous languages in this way, quote, "Language is the outward expression of an accumulation of learning experience shared by a group of people over centuries of development. It is not simply a vocal symbol. It is a dynamic force which shapes the way a man looks at the world, his thinking about the world, and his philosophy." The NIB also stressed the importance of language education, and they came up with two key areas that needed to be focused on: teaching the language and teaching in the language. They advocated for Indigenous children to be taught in their ancestral languages for the first 4 to 5 years, after English and French would be gradually introduced. It was further stressed the importance of engaging teachers who were fluent in local Indigenous dialects, and they made two recommendations. They wanted teacher aides specializing in Indigenous languages and have local language resource aides to assist professional teachers. And they wanted to waive the rigid teaching requirements to enable Indigenous peoples who are fluent in Indigenous languages to become full-fledged teachers. This is something that MALS and other language advocates are still advocating to this day. And this was being asked for in the 70s. Other recommendations focused on funding to develop language programs and studies and how to adapt oral languages to written forms. The report also critiqued the federal government's reluctance to invest in Indigenous languages as short-sighted approach to policy, given that teaching Indigenous languages to children would ultimately have long-term economic benefits for our communities. And then in 1977, just to look at a local response during this period, Mohawk students organized a walkout at the Howard S. Billings Regional High School because they were not learning their language and culture in the schools. The students walked from Chateauguay to Ganawaki, which resulted in the creation of immersion school for the Mohawk language. In 1979, the Mohawk people established an immersion programs that would ensure that the Mohawk language was passed on to future generation. It was called the Ganawaki Survival School. And it opened its doors in 1979. It was the first language immersion program in Canada. Equally important, the Mohawk people enacted a Ganawaki language law in 1999 to protect their language. And then, as you can see, in 1986 and 1988 up to 1992, there was significant studies done during this period about Indigenous languages. And AFN came out with a policy document called Aboriginal Language Policy Studies Phase 1 and 2. And the objective of these studies was to see whether there was feasibility to develop a First Nations language policy. And at that time, they determined not only was it critical, but that it was possible. The studies also recommended that language policy should be developed within the framework of self-government negotiations. And there was a great need to promote the use of language use at home to support Aboriginal language teachers. Cree scholar Verna Kirkness from Manitoba here in Fisher River proposed that a $100 million endowment fund would be established to protect the revitalization of Aboriginal languages and to support Aboriginal language education initiatives at the community level. During this period, chiefs across the country declared that a national state of emergency on languages was across the country. And again, this was in the 80s. They put out 3 key documents from 1990 to 2000 towards linguistic justice for First Nations, towards rebirth for First Nations languages, and National First Nations Language Strategy, A Time to Listen and the Time to Act. AFN started lobbying for Aboriginal language legislation also during this period to protect and promote Aboriginal languages and to raise the awareness that our languages were in fact endangered. There was a national policy, a national panel on First Nations elementary secondary education for students in 2011. And AFN provided significant recommendations on education. Panel members determined that the education system, again, continues to fail the needs of Indigenous peoples. And they attributed the problem to legislative provisions that are more than 100 years old and linked to a period that we now accept as deeply harmful and destructive, which was attributed to the residential school area. The panel also determined that school curriculum continued to impact Indigenous peoples because they do not support Indigenous identity. So the key emphasis again and again is that education is failing Indigenous people because it's not teaching Indigenous language, but also not teaching our children about their cultural identity in school. Many of the youth interviewed for this study informed the panel that they wanted to see curriculum that would provide them with a sense of belonging. In support of what they heard from the youth, panel members strongly urged curriculum must include Indigenous languages and history. As a result of this continued advocacy across the country, the federal government established a number of Royal Commission studies, bills, and a federal government program to administer funds to support Indigenous language revitalization. I've got another timeline here. And I just want to emphasize that the efforts that Indigenous people have made since the 60s has resulted in a lot of these, well, all of these standing committee reports, studies and advocacy and legislation well into the Languages Act that we have today. The other thing that has occurred is that we have regional legislation. We have the Indigenous Languages Act, but starting in the 70s, the Quebec initiated the French language charter that recognized Indigenous language rights in Quebec. The NWT enacted an Official Languages Act that includes around 8 Indigenous languages as the official languages of the Northwest Territories. And they also have other legislation that supports language use in the NWT. The Yukon established an agreement to support language revitalization through funding agreements. And Nunavut established in 2008 3 pieces of legislation: the Official Languages Act, the Inuit Language Protection Act, and the Education Act. When elders were interviewed during this period and asked what is the most significant part of their land claim, they all said that they wanted to protect Indigenous languages, and they wanted to ensure that the children continue to speak Indigenous Inuktitut, because their land and their land knowledge is so intricately tied to speaking Inuktitut. And so language rights was the heart of their land claims agreement and resulted in these 3 pieces of legislation. In Manitoba, we have the Aboriginal Languages Recognition Act. It recognizes the local languages of Manitoba, but that's about it. I just want to go back to this slide, because when I was doing research, one of the questions that I had was, why wasn't language rights articulated back when the French were advocating for French language rights in the Constitution in the 1980s? And I was quite surprised when I started going through the minutes of this special joint committee on the Constitution during this period, that Indigenous people were advocating for language rights. And I just want to read to you a couple of things that our leaders were saying during this period. So Chief James Gosnell, who is the president of the Nisga'a Tribal Council, examined the connection. Well, he was advocating language rights were enshrined in Aboriginal title. He also argued that Indigenous language rights are based on our customary laws and the people's cultural relationship to the land. And this is what he actually said to the government during this period. The Constitution, in my opinion, is not the source of rights. It is the result of history and tradition. But if there is any need to entrench anything, surely it must be the need to entrench the rights of Native people, the Aboriginal peoples of this land, because every other ethnic group, every other cultural group in this country does not draw the source of its culture from the North American continent. And you do. You have nowhere else to go to replenish your culture. He was speaking to Indigenous peoples. The land is our soul. It is our culture. It is all of our existence. And if there's anything that we need to entrench, it is our right to our traditions that we have established here. I want to emphasize that our Indigenous language rights are tied to our land and to our culture. And this was really, I think, important for Canada to hear at that point, because, and also I think it's important for Canada to know that as well, that our language rights come from our land rights. And part of the reason why the leadership was emphasizing that is because they knew that we needed resources to support our languages, just like the French and the English need support for the schools that are that teach English and French across the country. The resources that come from our land are supposed to provide us the necessary resources to protect our languages. Another statement that was made by Renee Simon, who was chairman of the Atikamekw Montagne Council at that time, also identified the shame around speaking Indigenous languages that resulted from the residential school. And he said, presently, we try and speak our languages as much as possible, contrary to what we did before, when Indians were perhaps ashamed, at least embarrassed, to speak their own languages. So what Mr. Renee Simon was saying at that time was that the impact from the schools and other assimilation policies have resulted in shame and was preventing a lot of the leaders at that time for advocating Indigenous language rights across the country in an explicit way. A letter written by Charlie Watt and Tagat Curley, the co-chairs for the Inuit Committee on National Issues at that time, requested a constitutional amendment guaranteeing resources to meet the cultural and linguistic needs of Aboriginal peoples based on prior occupation and distinct constitutional status. So what they were saying there, that because we were the first peoples of this country, that it's implicit that we have Indigenous language rights, and that again, due to our prior occupation, that we should have adequate resource to support the revitalization and support of our economic and cultural needs. So at the conclusion of these discussions in the 80s, Indigenous leaders advocated for Indigenous language rights in self-government, and that these self-government initiatives to support Indigenous languages should be adequately resourced as Indigenous land rights holders. The federal government's response during this period in 1988 was the Aboriginal Languages Initiative, ALI, which most of you have probably applied for funding for and have had issues with. But after years of advocacy and activism around Indigenous language rights that is based on our land rights, the federal government responded with a programmatic initiative that we are still working with today. Some of the criticisms during this period was that ALI was not developed in partnership with Indigenous peoples, and therefore does not reflect the nation-to-nation relationship between Canada and Aboriginal peoples. It also does not provide Indigenous peoples with the opportunity to make decisions about how to allocate scarce resource and how to administer programs. There was also strict criteria that did not allow resources to support critical areas for Indigenous language education, such as curriculum development and the need for immersion in other language programs. This is still an issue that we're dealing with today, in spite of the fact that we have an Indigenous Language Act. So I just want to say that all the way from my grandparents' generation to our leadership over the past few decades, that language rights has been advocated at the local level as well as the national level. And those efforts have resulted in legislation. And I think that those initiatives were critical for the advancement of Indigenous language rights, but I would argue that we still have a long way to go with this legislation. I appreciate the presentation that was made earlier about the work that the AFN is doing, but I still think that the legislation is weak. And I'm going to just explain that in this way. So on the slide here, I took an excerpt from the Constitution Act of 1982, which recognizes minority language rights to education. It's in Part 1 of the Constitution Act. It's in Section 23. Section 23 provides the right to have children educated in French or English. So children that are English speakers in Quebec have a right to education in English in Quebec, for example. Children that speak the French language, or families that speak the French language outside of Quebec, have a right to have their children educated in the French language. My daughter goes to a French immersion school right now. She's learning to speak French. She has books, she has materials, she's got computers, she's got teachers, and I don't pay for any of that. It's publicly funded. And the reason why she's able to be educated in French is because of this section. It requires the federal government to provide funding to these schools. It requires the federal government to ensure that there's adequate buildings, that children are bused, that there is support for curriculum. And if the federal government doesn't follow through, they are required by law. French and English speakers can go to court and ask the federal government, this is my constitutional right, you have to support our language programs. They have enforcement mechanisms in the Constitution to advance Indigenous language rights. If you look at the other section here that I pulled from, oh, sorry, I'm getting too far, okay. The Indigenous Languages Act now recognizes that Section 35 includes a right to Indigenous languages. It's a very important step. We now have language rights recognized in the Constitution under Section 35. And that's what the Indigenous Languages Act does, a very important step for Indigenous peoples. But when you look at the two, there are two significant things that I'd like to point out. Both are constitutionally protected language rights under the Constitution Act. One is for minority languages, French and English. The other is for Indigenous peoples. But there are two significant things missing for Indigenous peoples. We don't have anything in there that specifically says that we have a right to education. We have a right to educate our children in our languages. We have a right to federal services, which is very important for the Inuit up north. When they go to receive federal services, they should be serviced in their language. When they go into the healthcare system, they should be educated, or they should be receiving health services in Inuktitut, because it is the majority language of that territory. But in this section, in this Languages Act, there is nothing in there to say what our language rights are. It does say for the French and the English, right there underlined, English and French have the right to have their children receive primary and secondary instruction in that language in that province. This allows for funding for schools and curriculum. And when you look at the funding disparities that are occurring in Canada right now with language education. So when the Indigenous Languages Act was passed, it was announced that $337 million over the next 5 years would be allocated for Indigenous language programs to support community-based programs. That works out to $66 million per year for over 50 Indigenous languages to work on language initiatives. That same year, the government announced that it was increasing support for minority language education, adding $60 million over the next 4 years to an existing $235 million for 2 languages. So you can see the disparity of funding for language education in this country. And I just point this out because we've done so much work for language advocacy, we've done so much language advocacy work over the years, from my grandparents' generation to Indigenous leaders across the country. We still have a lot of work to do in this area, and a lot of advocacy work to ensure that at the bare minimum that we have the same rights that English and French do have for education of their children in this country. So I don't want to leave on a dismal note. I wanted to end this talk by talking about some of the people that have influenced me over the years. We have a lot of language advocates in our communities, and here are some of them. Some of them you might recognize. Each of these people have had an impact on the activist work that I currently do. Of course, starting from my grandparents. Verna Kirkness, who I mentioned earlier in the talk, a fisher from the Fisher River Cree Nation. She highlights the cultural loss that Canada would suffer should the current rate of linguistic decline continue. And she says, "What do you lose when you lose a language? The short answer is that you lose your culture. Language is the best way to express most easily and most accurately the values, customs, and interests of our culture. If you lose the language, you lose things that are essentially the way of life, the way of thought, the way of valuing, and particularly human reality." Ida Bear and Annie Belanger. Ida Bear is from Norway House Cree Nation, and Annie Belanger from Barons River. They have played a pivotal role in the revitalization and protection of Indigenous languages where I work at the University of Winnipeg. They've been teaching Indigenous students at the post-secondary level for over 2 decades. Andrea Bear-Nicholas is somebody that I work on advocacy work on a national scale and who's been my mentor for a number of years. She's from the Tobique First Nation. She established the Native Language Immersion Teacher Training Program and Adult Immersion Program in Maliseet a number of years ago. She says that the one important goal is to create fluent speakers who can become preschool and elementary teachers in the medium of Indigenous languages. And quote, "It is not merely about teaching the language, but about teaching in the language. This is based on the principles that immersion is the fastest and most efficient way to learn a language. It is also based on the need to produce child speakers of Indigenous languages to ensure that the language will survive into the future." Andrea Bear-Nicholas emphasizes that immersion education is our only hope, especially since the core programs for teaching Indigenous languages in the schools have existed now for decades, but have been totally underfunded. Dorothea Lazor, she was instrumental in providing teacher training for both the Mi'kmaq languages and the Mohawk language immersion programs. Brian Miracle is also an advocate for Indigenous language rights in Canada, but he's a member of the Mohawk First Nation. And after he moved back to his reserve, he began to learn the Mohawk language. And with his wife, Audrey, they established a full-time adult immersion school in 1988. These are the next generation of advocates in our country for Indigenous language rights, and I admire all of them. Some of them, well, I know one of them was a speaker at the symposium, Heather Suter. And now McIver is Swampy Cree. She's got the long hair and the long brown hair and the blue, and she's wearing blue and purple. She's an associate professor and former director of Indigenous education at the University of Victoria. And she's also president and president of the Foundation for Endangered Languages in Canada. She says all Canadians need to learn about the land beneath their feet, learn about First Peoples whose land they live on, and care about that. She advocates for fighting to resurrect and revitalize Indigenous languages. Belinda Daniels, who's in the green, she's Cree from Saskatchewan. She's a student of the Cree language. And she believes in the strong connection between language and identity and seeks to create pride and self-esteem in her Cree students by teaching their history, traditional knowledge of the land, and proficiency in their language and text. She's established a successful summer camp that has been running for 11 years now. She was also involved in developing a high school curriculum for core Cree with the Ministry of Education in Saskatchewan, and has initiated a led bilingual Cree elementary program. Kevin Lewis, who's Cree from Saskatchewan, started a Cree immersion school in response to a community survey designed to determine the importance of language and culture. The survey revealed an overwhelming need to preserve and revitalize and normalize the Cree language. He says, I hope to inspire others to implement their own cultural revitalization initiatives. Such programs provide opportunities for Indigenous youth to develop traditional skills, learn about their native cultures, and speak their ancestral language. But more importantly, these types of programs allow younger generations to reconnect with their elders. Brian McGinnis, who's holding the mic, is a member of the Ojibwe Nation and direct descendant of the Wisconsin Potawatomi tribe. He says that successfully revitalizing Indigenous languages is one of the greatest challenges of the present. This is particularly significant when one considers that Native peoples have no other place in the world to retrieve their language should they disappear. When an Indigenous language is no longer spoken in a community or region, it often ceases to exist as a living language. Teaching and learning in a community-based setting has proven beneficial to increase awareness and overall proficiency. Next, Ondeg Muldrew, who's standing there with his kukum, Pat Ningwans. Ondeg Muldrew, who I think is now 20, but he was the University of Manitoba and U of W's youngest sessional instructor ever, who taught introductory Ojibwe for a couple of years. He started learning the language from his grandmother, from Pat Ningwans, when he was 10. And he said that it's a struggle to learn and think in Ojibwe because it's just getting brought back. And we're surrounded by English in Winnipeg. But given the history of language loss after colonization and residential schools, it's almost like an act of defiance speaking in Ojibwe. And he says that now he has a sense of pride in being able to speak to my grandmother in Ojibwe. The last two that I'd like to speak about are Heather Suter and Aluki Kotierek. Heather Suter, who's wearing the Métis sash and also a speaker at the symposium, realized how endangered the Michif language was, and she moved back to Manitoba to revitalize it. She teaches now at the U of M, but is doing amazing work from Camperville for the revitalization of the Michif language. And I am very inspired by the work that she does. Aluki Kotierek is now the president of the Nunavut Tungavik Incorporated. She is a language advocate for Inuktitut and speaks nationally and internationally on Indigenous language rights in Canada. And she says fighting for Inuktitut in her homeland is a challenge, but it is also fighting to expand the narrow parameters set by the Indigenous Languages Act to include Indigenous language rights to education, public service in the areas of health and injustice. So I would just like to say miigwech for inviting me here to share the incredible work that our people have done for advancing Indigenous language rights in this country. And I would like to just say miigwech, to take this opportunity to say miigwech to my family, in particular my grandparents, because they created a strong foundation for me to do this work. I really appreciate this opportunity to share this research, but also my family's activism. Miigwech.
Okay, we're not going to have time for any questions. And I'd like to thank Lorena for your presentation.